The report is astonishing when you look at it. Does it really have to be that way?
Tonight, a new study says emissions from the Alberta oil sands are higher than previously reported.
We do have enough information that we could certainly match names up should we receive any further names.
In Saskatchewan, the Coroner Services has partnered with the National Truth and Reconciliation Centre to help identify those who did not make it home.
Communities are forced to fight with bureaucrats, do endless paperwork to try and get some of their own money back.
And a one-on-one interview with Conservative Party of Canada leader Pierre Poilievre. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. The Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples heard from Saskatchewan's Chief Coroner, Clive Wayhill, on Wednesday night. He was part of the study about organizations that have not yet released their records on children who attended Indian residential schools. APTN's Rachel May has more.
Before 2015, the record-keeping process for those who died in residential schools was entirely on paper. In 2015, Wayhill's team gathered boxes of files from across the province to begin the process of accurately cataloging them.
We didn't slow down on it at all. We made sure that we could live up to what our commitment was.
The Coroner Service has partnered with the National Truth and Reconciliation Centre to help identify residential school children who never made it home. A spreadsheet was created with file numbers, ages, gender, place of birth, date of death, and cause of death. Wayhill's office completed over 400 searches of the approximately 600 names provided by the Truth and Reconciliation Centre, and they're ready for more.
But we do have enough information that we could certainly match names up should we receive any further names.
Wayhill says the coroner's office only investigates unnatural deaths like murder, suicide, fire, drowning, and overdoses. If people want to know more about residential school students who died of natural causes, Saskatchewan's Vital Statistics has that information. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A new environmental study by Yale University and the Government of Canada shows that emissions from the Alberta oil sands facilities are many times higher than what was being reported. But the findings are no surprise to Athabasca Chippewa Chief Alan Adam. APTN's Chris Stewart has that story.
The study began in 2018 with researchers from Yale and Environment Canada measuring carbon gases emitted by 17 facilities in the Athabasca oil sands by flying over them. Industry records emissions at ground level. What they found was emissions were 19 to 64 times higher than what the facility owners were reporting. John Leggio is a scientist with the federal government. He co-authored the study. He says he believes there are more tools that industry can use to get more accurate readings.
It's probably not feasible to be flying a plane, every month for a whole year with all of the very expensive and complex instrumentation that we were using on the aircraft. But we did have some novel instruments that are relatively simple that showed us that there was a discrepancy between the total that we measure and the total that is reported.
He says the emissions are not the greenhouse gases that lead to climate change, but they can lead to health issues downwind of the sites.
So the issue with having these high emissions is that ultimately all of these gas phase compounds end up forming particulate matter downwind, sometimes near, sometimes far, and along the way. And PM, we know, is a health issue around the world. It's similar. The PM is similar to PM that you would expect to be exposed to, for example, from forest fire smoke.
APTN spoke to Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation in northern Alberta. He says the report is no surprise to him.
We've been doing our own community-based monitoring program since probably way back in 2010, 2009. We do water sampling and everything and stuff like that. And, we've been finding samples of abnormality, I guess it's not right in the ecosystem and stuff like that. And this just confirms the fact that what they found, we've been finding all along.
Adam says industry and government need to talk to Indigenous peoples to find a solution.
The report is astonishing when you look at it. Does it really have to be that way? Could it have been done differently? I think, in our view, it could have done a lot better if we had just did what we told industry all along, what needed to get done, because the First Nations were right all along.
In a statement, the Alberta Ministry of Environment said that in the past decade, per barrel emissions have dropped 21%, and another 23% drop is expected in the next decade. It goes on to say, "We stand by our province's regulatory and monitoring approach while recognizing that we need to keep learning and evolving." It does not mention any upcoming meetings to discuss the report's findings. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
To the north now, where the government of Yukon has responded to a judicial review launched by an Indigenous inmate who claims he was illegally placed in segregation at the Whitehorse Correctional Centre. Inmate Norman Kendi filed an application in December alleging he was illegally placed in a segregation unit following an altercation with a corrections officer. The government has now responded to that application, and it disputes Kendi's allegations, claiming instead that the jail does not have a segregation unit, nor was Kendi ever placed in what is legally defined as segregation, among other things. A hearing for Kendi's application has not yet been set. Kendi is one of two people charged in the killing of Aaron Smarch in Whitehorse last year. Time for a quick break. Still to come, a one-on-one with Conservative Party of Canada leader Pierre Poilievre.
I don't want to run anybody's life. I want to get out of the way, off your back, and let all Canadians, and including First Nations, chart their own path and set their own destiny.
Welcome back. Official opposition leader Pierre Poilievre was in Vancouver today to make an announcement about First Nations keeping more resource revenue dollars at home. Following the announcement, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada sat down with us to discuss his party's plans for improving the lives of Indigenous peoples across Canada. Mr. Poilievre, appreciate you taking some time for us here today. Today you've announced what is called an optional First Nations resource charge that you say will put First Nations back in control of their money. Can you tell us how it would work?
Thank you. Yes, it is a historic announcement that sees the Conservative Party endorse and commit to implement the First Nations resource charge that Chief Commissioner Manny Jules of Kamloops, who's the head of the First Nations Tax Commission, has built. So this is how it works. When a resource company is harvesting resources in a First Nations community, right now they often have to negotiate very complicated impact benefit agreements, and that consumes a lot of time and does not properly compensate the local First Nation for the resources consumed. So what I have endorsed is a First Nations-led solution which would cede federal tax room to First Nations governments, who can then collect those taxes directly from the company and use them how they wish without having to ask for Ottawa for any approvals. So instead of having the money go to Ottawa in federal taxes, and then the community has to go to the departments and ask for grants and contributions, the money will just stay with the First Nation. It will be strictly optional, so any community that prefers the existing or other arrangements can pursue those, but this will give them an option that the federal government will remove the overburdensome bureaucracy in Ottawa and allow the local community to control its money and its decisions.
You were joined, of course, by First Nations leaders that are in favor of this plan at the news conference. First Nations here in Manitoba reacting to the announcement, saying they remain hopeful that the Conservative Party will champion the advancement of First Nations inherent and treaty rights, and that they approach this initiative with caution, considering historical policies and laws from the Harper era. Your thoughts on those concerns?
We have to move forward together. One of the great injustices that has led to so much poverty is that the government in Ottawa has far too much power. Ottawa concentrates all the decisions and the power. The Indian Act, which was passed in Ottawa by politicians there who are not First Nations, says that all the land and money of reserves belongs to the Crown. I think that's one of the root causes of the problem, is that when First Nations develop resources or local economies, the revenues go to the federal government, and then communities are forced to fight with bureaucrats, do endless paperwork to try and get some of their own money back. What I'm saying here is let's cede federal tax room to First Nations governments so they can harvest their own revenue for clean water, job training, health care, and other advancements in the community. And the federal government will reduce the tax burden so that the money comes directly to the community rather than going to the government. This is about putting First Nations back in control of their money, their resources, their land, and their lives. It means more power for local First Nations leaders and less control for bureaucrats in Ottawa and politicians in Ottawa.
Mr. Poilievre, I'm not sure if you know, but you're the first leader of the Conservative Party to speak with APTN News. Could you tell our audience why Indigenous peoples who've not traditionally voted Conservative in a federal election should do so in the next one?
First of all, I think there are a lot of values Conservatives and First Nations people share. Family, tradition, harvesting the land for a living. Look at the issues on which Conservatives and First Nations are lining up on the same side. First Nations, 130 First Nations are fighting the carbon tax in court. I'm the only leader that will axe the tax altogether. First Nations rose up to defend their hunting rights by opposing Trudeau's ban on hunting rifles and other firearms. And I'm the only leader that will defend your right to keep your hunting rifle and your firearm. First Nations are pushing for economic development through resource projects, commercial enterprises, and other opportunities. And I'm the only one that wants to remove the red tape and the taxation by the federal government to free the communities to do that. I believe that we need to build this friendship, and I believe that my job is to be a servant to the First Nations people. That's what the word minister means, first servant. Unfortunately, some politicians in Ottawa think their role is to be master. I don't want to run anybody's life. I want to get out of the way, off your back, and let all Canadians, and including First Nations, chart their own path and set their own destiny. And this is a wonderfully optimistic vision. I think the First Nations people are going to lead the country in economic development. Look what the Tsuut'ina are doing with their commercial developments. Look at Chief Louis and Osoyoos building tourism and other enterprises. Look at Enoch, which balanced its budget, paid off its debt, and has built an incredible local economy. I could go on. Oh, look, I should go on one last example. The Squamish people who are building 6,000 housing units on 10 acres of land, benefiting their people and housing many others because they know how to get things done. In fact, I think the First Nations governments are increasingly the best run governments in the country, and I want to draw inspiration from that.
Well, one of those things that you just touched on, climate change being one of them, is having, you could say, an outsized effect, of course, on First Nations, Indigenous communities with wildfire seasons displacing entire communities, and infrastructure such as winter roads now being built later in the year, melting earlier. What type of supports would your government have for Indigenous communities to help adapt to the changing climate?
That's a great question. We need to focus on climate adaptation because it is happening, and we will redirect money away from bureaucracy and towards concrete infrastructure improvements that will protect First Nations from the effects of climate change. We'll also get rid of the carbon tax, which is driving up the cost of necessary traditional energy in rural, remote, and cold communities. Many of those communities are First Nations communities, obviously. So instead of punishing people for living on their ancestral lands, heating their homes and driving their trucks, we're going to enable in technology, not taxes. Let's allow for the development of hydroelectric dams, nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, geothermal projects that all generate emissions-free electricity. And with the First Nations resource charge, we can allow the communities that host these projects to directly collect the tax revenue and invest them back in their people.
Mr. Poilievre, of course, housing has been an important part of what you've been speaking about in a lot of people. What steps would your government take to make sure that Indigenous peoples have access to housing? People are living, 10 people to a house right now.
Yes. After 8 years of Trudeau, housing costs have doubled, rent has doubled, mortgage payments have doubled, down payments needed for a new home have all doubled. And this is because money printing by the overspending federal government is ballooning inflation and driving up interest rates, and local government bureaucracies, particularly municipal, are blocking construction. So my common sense plan caps spending and cuts waste to balance the budget and bring down interest rates. Secondly, I will incentivize local governments to speed up and lower the cost of building permits by linking the number of federal infrastructure dollars they get to the number of homes that are built. Now, one thing I'm looking for direction from First Nations communities on is how can we replicate the incredible housing successes that some communities have had in expediting construction, employing young First Nations tradespeople who can go on to get red seals in their trade, so that we can build more housing in First Nations communities, and the First Nations governments can actually profit off of some innovative housing ideas like the Squamish development in Vancouver.
Mr. Poilievre, I know we're short on time. Just one last question. Many First Nations are going through troubling times right now when it comes to housing, when it comes to mental health, addictions, these types of things. What would your government do to turn the tide on some of these things?
Unfortunately, these tragedies have become all too common in both First Nations and non-First Nations communities. I saw just yesterday, I think there was something like 16 overdoses in Belleville alone. But when I met with Treaty Nations from Alberta the other day in Ottawa, they told me they are seeing the same thing. Fentanyl and other hard opioids are everywhere. So my common sense plan is to stop giving out taxpayer-funded opioids as a so-called safe supply. Instead, put that money into detox treatment and recovery to bring our loved ones home drug-free. We have to seal our borders against the importation of the precursors making fentanyl and other deadly drugs. So I would scan all of the shipping containers coming in and out of our country, interrupt crime networks that are bringing these drugs from China, from Mexico, and from other places, so that we protect our people against these poisons and give people a chance at a healthy, drug-free life.
Mr. Poilievre, I know we have to leave it there. Appreciate you taking some time for us. Hopefully it won't be the last time.
Thank you. Well, I think we share our priorities to axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime right across Canada. Those are some of my priorities, and I'm happy to work with First Nations to bring home a brighter future for us all.
Okay, it is Friday Junior, and Thursdays mean new episodes of Nation to Nation. We've got a preview of that and more after the break. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. This amazing golden orange sunset over the Ottawa River at Petrie Island. Thank you to regular contributor Greg Scriver for sharing this photo. He says that this is also a famous tree that survived 3 floods in the past few years. If you want to be featured as our photo of the day, you can email your pictures to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, +2 in Halifax and Fredericton. -15 in Kuujjuaq, cloudy and 12 below for Nain. 5 above in Montreal and Val-d'Or. Snow and 0 for Sault Ste. Marie, +6 in North Bay. Flurries and 5 above in Thunder Bay, -2 with snow in Sioux Lookout. -12 with snow for God's Lake and Thompson, 10 below in Norway House. Snow and 8 below in Winnipeg, -7 in Dauphin. -5 for Regina and Saskatoon with flurries. -8 in La Ronge and Buffalo Narrows. In northern Alberta, -11 in High Level, 12 below in Peace River. -4 for Edmonton, 7 below and snow in Lethbridge. 7 above for Vancouver and Victoria, 0 in Kamloops. -3 in Prince George, 4 below in Smithers. -23 in Old Crow, snow and -8 in Whitehorse. -18 for Yellowknife, -14 in Norman Wells. Snow and 20 below in Sax Harbor, -13 in Paulatuck. 25 below for Chesterfield and Arviette, -26 in Whale Cove. 28 below in Resolute, -25 in Arctic Bay. Time to head over to our Ottawa studio now. That's where Fraser Needham is standing by with a look at tonight's Nation to Nation.
Coming up after the news on Nation to Nation, a major Supreme Court decision is set to come down tomorrow on the federal government's Indigenous child welfare legislation that gives Indigenous communities more control in this area. We'll talk to the director of Indigenous Law Centre at the University of Alberta about what it all means. We'll also talk to Yukon University professor Ken Coates and get his thoughts on Bill C-53. That's the Trudeau government's proposed legislation that recognizes Métis governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And Dr. Lana Potts of Deloitte Canada is here to talk about a new study the company has done on Indigenous youth and mental health. Stay tuned.
And you can watch Nation to Nation right here in about 90 seconds from now. We're all out of time for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime or more on anything you've seen here, head over to our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech, thanks for being with us. Stay tuned. Nation to Nation's up next. We will see you back here tomorrow.